Imagine a woman so consumed by desire that ancient historians claimed she competed with professional prostitutes to see who could bed more men in a single night. A woman so shameless, they said, that she disguised herself with a blonde wig and worked in the filthiest brothels of Rome under an alias, servicing client after client until dawn broke over the imperial city. An empress who allegedly bedded 25 men in 24 hours and won the contest. This was Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius, and for 2,000 years her name has been synonymous with insatiable lust, political scheming, and moral corruption. But here's what nobody tells you about Messalina. Every single story you've heard about her might be a lie. The salacious tales, the brothel visits, the sexual marathons, they all come from sources written decades after her death by men who had every reason to destroy her reputation. The question isn't whether Messalina was Rome's most perverted empress. The question is whether she was perverted at all, or simply a victim of the most successful character assassination in ancient history. Before we go any deeper, if stories about power, sex, and the lies that shape history fascinate you, subscribe to the Codex of History and hit that like button, and as this story unfolds, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. Valeria Messalina was born sometime between 17 and 20 AD, though historians remain uncertain about her exact birth year. What is certain is that she was born into the very heart of Roman imperial power. Her bloodline was extraordinary. Through her father, Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus, she descended from the prestigious Valerii family. Through her mother, Domitia Lepida, she was the great-granddaughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, the sister of Emperor Augustus himself. This meant Messalina had stronger connections to Rome's first emperor than her future husband Claudius did. She was related to everyone who mattered in imperial Rome. Emperor Caligula was her second cousin. The future Emperor Nero was her first cousin, though 17 years younger. She moved through the most elite circles of Roman society from the moment she drew her first breath. But aristocratic blood didn't guarantee wealth, and based on what little we know of her family's circumstances, Messalina's lineage had fallen on harder financial times. When Messalina was somewhere between 14 and 18 years old, her family arranged a marriage that would change everything. The groom was Tiberius Claudius, her second cousin once removed. The marriage occurred around 38 AD, when Claudius was approximately 47 years old. He walked with a pronounced limp, stammered when he spoke, and had already failed at 2 previous marriages. He was viewed by many as the embarrassment of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family member everyone tried to keep out of sight. But he had imperial blood and some wealth, and for Messalina's family, that was enough. Nobody, including Messalina herself, could have predicted what would happen next. In the year 41 AD, Emperor Caligula was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. The guards, needing to legitimize their coup by finding another member of the imperial family, discovered Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified he'd be killed next. Instead, they declared him emperor. Overnight, the stammering, limping man who'd been pushed to the margins of public life became the most powerful person in the known world. And Messalina, now somewhere between 21 and 24 years old, became Empress of Rome. What happened next secured her position in ways she could scarcely have imagined. On February 12, 41 AD, less than a month after Claudius became emperor, Messalina gave birth to a son. They named him Tiberius Claudius Germanicus, though he would later be called Britannicus after his father's conquest of Britain in 43 AD. The timing was extraordinarily fortuitous. As the mother of the emperor's son and presumed heir, Messalina's position seemed unassailable. Or so she thought. In reality, she had just stepped into the most dangerous role any woman in Rome could occupy. Everything we think we know about Messalina comes from three primary sources, and every single one of them is deeply problematic. The first is Tacitus, who wrote his annals roughly 70 years after Messalina's death. Tacitus is often considered one of Rome's greatest historians, but he lived and wrote during a period intensely hostile to the Julio-Claudian dynasty to which Messalina belonged. Emperors from later dynasties had every interest in painting the earlier imperial family as corrupt and degenerate to justify their own rule. Even Tacitus himself admitted that his account of Messalina's most outrageous acts seemed so unbelievable that readers might think he was making it up. He used the word fabulosus, essentially acknowledging his story read like fiction or melodrama. What's more, Tacitus relied heavily on the memoirs of Agrippina the Younger, who became Claudius's fourth wife after Messalina's death. Agrippina had her own son, the future Emperor Nero, and needed to discredit Messalina's son Britannicus to secure Nero's claim to the throne. Painting Messalina as sexually promiscuous called into question whether Britannicus was even Claudius's legitimate son. This was propaganda with a purpose. If people believed Messalina had countless lovers, how could anyone be certain of her children's paternity? Agrippina's entire political strategy depended on destroying Messalina's reputation, and Tacitus uncritically repeated her version of events. The second major source is Suetonius, who wrote The 12 Caesars around the same time period. Suetonius had a reputation even in his own era for being what we might call today a tabloid journalist. The Encyclopaedia Britannica notes that he was free with scandalous gossip, and that he used characteristic anecdote without exhaustive inquiry into its authenticity. Suetonius categorized emperors as either good or bad, then cherry-picked stories to fit his predetermined narrative. Claudius was filed under bad, which meant his wives had to be portrayed as terrible as well. Suetonius wrote about women only in the context of the men in their lives. For him, Messalina existed purely as evidence of Claudius's poor judgment and weakness. The third source is the satirist Juvenal, who wrote even later, in the early 2nd century AD. Juvenal's job as a satirist was not to report facts, but to entertain through exaggeration and moral condemnation. Ancient satire was meant to shock and amuse readers, not provide historical accuracy. Yet many of the most salacious details about Messalina come exclusively from Juvenal's 6th satire, a bitter diatribe about why men shouldn't get married because women are inherently corrupt. This was the ancient equivalent of an angry opinion piece, not investigative journalism. And yet, for centuries, readers treated Juvenal's poetry as documented fact. All three of these men wrote decades after Messalina died, in political environments where trashing her reputation served multiple purposes. None of them were eyewitnesses to her alleged crimes. None of them had access to unbiased sources, and all of them had strong incentives to portray her as a monster. This doesn't mean everything they wrote was false, but it demands we approach their accounts with extreme skepticism. The most famous story about Messalina comes from Juvenal's 6th satire, and it's so vivid, so shocking, that it burned itself into Western imagination for 2 millennia. According to Juvenal, as soon as Emperor Claudius fell asleep each night, Messalina would put on a hooded cloak, hide her distinctive black hair under a cheap blonde wig, and slip out of the imperial palace with just one servant. She would make her way through the dark streets to the Suburra, one of Rome's most squalid neighborhoods, where she worked in a brothel under the assumed name Lycisca, meaning she-wolf. Juvenal describes in graphic detail how she would stand in the doorway of her reserved cell, her breasts bare and nipples gilded with gold paint, welcoming client after client throughout the night. When the brothel's owner finally closed for the evening and sent the other prostitutes home, Messalina allegedly refused to leave. She would drag herself back to the palace at dawn, Juvenal writes, exhausted by men but not yet satisfied, carrying the smell of the brothel back to the imperial bedchamber. It's an incredible image. It's also almost certainly complete fiction. Think about the logistics for just a moment. Messalina was one of the most recognizable women in the Roman Empire. Her face appeared on coins. She participated in public ceremonies. Thousands of people in Rome would have known what she looked like. The idea that she could disguise herself with a wig and work as a prostitute in a public brothel without being instantly recognized strains credulity past the breaking point. Roman society was intensely gossip-driven. The imperial court was a fishbowl where nothing stayed secret. If the empress were actually sneaking out to work as a prostitute, the scandal would have destroyed her immediately, not decades later. But wait, there's more. Another ancient author, Pliny the Elder, provides what seems like corroboration of Messalina's sexual appetite. In his Natural History, written as an encyclopedia of knowledge about the natural world, Pliny includes a section on human sexuality. He uses Messalina as an example of humanity's unique lack of sexual satiation compared to other animals. According to Pliny, Messalina engaged in a competition with one of Rome's most famous prostitutes named Scylla to see who could have sex with the most men in a 24-hour period. Messalina, Pliny claims, won decisively after betting her 25th partner, while Scylla gave up exhausted. Unlike Juvenal, Pliny was alive during Claudius's reign. He was a young military officer serving in Germany while Messalina was empress, which might make him seem like a more reliable source. But Pliny wasn't in Rome during the events he describes. He was repeating gossip he'd heard, probably years later, in a section of his encyclopedia about animal reproduction. He provides no details about when or where this competition allegedly took place, who witnessed it, or how he learned about it. It reads less like documented history and more like the kind of outrageous rumor that spreads about powerful people, growing more exaggerated with each telling. The later historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century AD, over 150 years after Messalina's death, escalates the story even further. In his version, Messalina didn't just work in a brothel. She ran a prostitution ring out of the imperial palace itself, forcing aristocratic women to have sex with men while their husbands watched helplessly. This is where the story crosses from scandalous gossip into obvious political propaganda. Each generation of historians added more outrageous details, competing to make Messalina seem more depraved than the last writer claimed. By Dio's time, the real woman had disappeared entirely beneath layers of sensational fiction designed to entertain readers and make moral points about female sexuality and power. But beneath all the lurid stories about brothels and sexual competitions, there's another Messalina, the one the ancient sources inadvertently reveal when they stop focusing on her sex life and actually describe her political activities. This Messalina was ruthless, calculating, and dangerous, but not because of her sexual appetite. She was dangerous because she wielded real political power in an empire that had no formal role for women to do so. As empress and mother of the heir apparent, Messalina had unprecedented influence over Claudius. The emperor, absorbed in his administrative reforms and historical scholarship, delegated much of the day-to-day management of the imperial household to his wife and his freedmen secretaries. This created opportunities for someone ambitious and clever to accumulate real power. And Messalina, whatever else she may have been, was undeniably ambitious and clever. The ancient sources accuse her of orchestrating numerous executions and forced suicides, and these charges carry more weight than the sexual allegations because they involve named individuals with documented deaths. One of her earliest alleged victims was Appius Junius Silanus, a a respected commander who had married Messalina's mother. Sources disagree on whether his execution occurred in 42 or 43 AD, though the events themselves are well documented. According to ancient accounts, Messalina became infatuated with her stepfather, but he rejected her advances. Tacitus and Dio claim that Messalina conspired with Narcissus, one of Claudius's powerful freedmen, to eliminate Silanus. They told Claudius they had both independently had dreams the previous night in which Silanus murdered the emperor. When Silanus arrived at the palace the next morning, his mere presence seemed to confirm the prophecy, and Claudius ordered his immediate execution. The story is dramatic, perhaps too dramatic, but Appius Silanus was definitely executed in 42 AD, and someone orchestrated it. Whether Messalina's motive was rejected sexual advances or political calculation, we can't know for certain. But the execution happened, demonstrating that the young empress could influence her husband to kill powerful men on little more than her word. Perhaps the most revealing case is that of Valerius Asiaticus, one of Rome's wealthiest senators. Asiaticus owned the magnificent gardens of Lucullus, one of the most beautiful estates in Rome, in either 46 or 47 AD, depending on which ancient source you consult. Messalina wanted those gardens for herself. According to Tacitus, she fabricated charges of adultery and treason against Asiaticus. When he was brought before Claudius for trial, it wasn't held in the Senate as tradition demanded, but in one of the emperor's bedrooms, with Messalina present and weeping on cue. Claudius initially seemed inclined to believe Asiaticus's defense, but Messalina's political ally, Lucius Vitellius, convinced the emperor to order Asiaticus to commit suicide. After his death, Messalina took possession of his gardens. The significance of this event goes beyond one woman's greed for a beautiful estate. It demonstrates that Messalina had built a network of political allies who would help her destroy enemies and acquire wealth. She understood how to manipulate legal processes for personal gain. She knew how to play on her husband's emotions and paranoia. These are the actions of a skilled political operator, not a mindless nymphomaniac driven only by sexual desire. Modern historians increasingly suggest that many of Messalina's alleged affairs may have actually been political alliances. In Roman politics, sexual relationships and political relationships were often synonymous. When ancient sources accused a woman of having an affair with a powerful man, they might have been describing a political alliance that threatened the emperor. The charge of adultery was a convenient way to delegitimize any woman who dared wield political influence. By the autumn of 48 AD, Messalina had been empress for 7 years. Her son Britannicus was now 7 years old, still years away from being able to rule on his own. And Claudius, at 57, was showing signs of declining health. For Messalina, this created a terrifying vulnerability. If Claudius died before Britannicus came of age, mother and son would both be in extreme danger. Roman history was littered with the bodies of unsuccessful claimants to imperial power and their families. It was in this context that Messalina became involved with Gaius Silius, a senator who had been designated consul for the following year. Silius was, according to Tacitus, the best-looking young man in Rome. He was also intelligent, charismatic, well-educated, and politically ambitious. Historical sources claim Messalina forced Silius to divorce his wife Junia so she could have him entirely to herself. She showered him with gifts from the imperial treasury. She moved furniture and slaves from the palace into his house. The affair became so public that Tacitus notes even in gossip-obsessed Rome, where nothing stayed secret, people were shocked by her brazenness. Then came the event that sealed her fate. While Claudius was in the port city of Ostia overseeing the construction of a new harbor, Messalina and Silius held a wedding ceremony. Not a secret midnight ritual, but a full formal wedding with contract signed, vows exchanged, witnesses present, and a lavish banquet that included some of Rome's most prominent citizens. They even held a mock grape harvest and Bacchic celebration, complete with frenzied dancing and wine flowing freely. Tacitus himself expresses disbelief that this actually happened. He writes that he knows it will seem like fiction, like he's making up a story too absurd to be true, but he insists multiple sources confirm it. The wedding was real. But what did it mean? The ancient sources disagree. Tacitus suggests Silius convinced Messalina that Claudius's overthrow was inevitable and that her best chance of survival was to align herself with the next emperor before the coup happened. Other sources suggest Messalina coveted the name of wife after years of being married to an elderly man she didn't love. Some modern historians interpret this as a genuine coup attempt, with Messalina and Silius planning to have Silius adopt Britannicus, overthrow Claudius, and rule together as regents. The strangest part is what didn't happen. After the wedding ceremony, Silius went back to his regular senatorial duties. Messalina returned to the palace. Neither made any apparent attempt to flee or seize power militarily. They acted as if marrying while the emperor was out of town was somehow going to work out fine. It suggests either spectacular arrogance, spectacular stupidity, or that the whole event wasn't the carefully planned coup the ancient sources claimed. When news of the wedding reached Claudius in Ostia, his initial reaction was panic. According to Tacitus, he kept asking his advisors over and over, "Am I still emperor? Is Silius still a private citizen?" The freedman Narcissus, who had built his power on being indispensable to Claudius, recognized that this crisis could destroy him too if not handled correctly. He took command of the Praetorian Guard for one day and convinced Claudius that unless he acted immediately, Silius would control Rome. Claudius rushed back to the city in a carriage with Narcissus and his advisor Vitellius. Silius was arrested at the Forum and quickly executed, along with several alleged co-conspirators. But what about Messalina? When she learned Claudius was returning to Rome, she tried to reach him first. She sent their children ahead, Octavia and little Britannicus, to meet their father and plead for her. She enlisted the help of the highest-ranking Vestal Virgin to intercede on her behalf. Then she climbed into a humble garden cart, a strange choice for an empress, and rode out to meet Claudius's entourage on the road. What followed was a public confrontation between the two people Claudius had trusted most. Messalina cried out that he must listen to the mother of his children. Narcissus shouted over her, listing her infidelities and drowning out her pleas with accusations. Claudius, caught between them, retreated to the Praetorian camp to think. He visited Silius's house and saw all the imperial property Messalina had given her lover. The evidence was overwhelming, but even then, even after everything, Claudius hesitated. After dining that evening, wine softening his anger, he asked that the poor woman be brought to him the next morning so he could hear her defense. Narcissus recognized immediately that if Messalina got that audience, if Claudius saw her in person with their children, he would forgive her. The emperor's feelings were wavering, and if Messalina survived, Narcissus knew she would eventually destroy him for his role in exposing her. So Narcissus acted. He claimed to be following Claudius's orders when he commanded the centurions and a military tribune to go to the gardens of Lucullus, where Messalina had taken refuge, and execute her. The grim irony wasn't lost on anyone. These were the gardens she had stolen from Valerius Asiaticus just a year earlier. Now, she was going to die there. Messalina was found in the gardens of Lucullus with her mother, Domitia Lepida. The two women had been estranged during Messalina's years of power and wealth, but now, faced with her daughter's inevitable death, Lepida had come to her side. The soldiers gave Messalina the option considered honorable for people of her class. She could take her own life with dignity rather than be executed like a common criminal. Lepida urged her daughter not to wait for the executioner, to seek death with honor as so many condemned nobles had done before her. Messalina took the dagger in her hand, but she couldn't do it. Tacitus sneers at this detail, suggesting that a woman who had allegedly committed so many crimes, who had supposedly been so bold and shameless, lacked even the basic courage to end her own life properly. But perhaps it reveals something more human. Perhaps, at somewhere between 25 and 28 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, if only Claudius would listen, if only she could explain, Messalina simply wanted to live. She held the dagger to her throat, then to her breast, but couldn't summon the will to push it in. Time ran out. The tribune and the centurion lost patience. According to both Tacitus and Suetonius, the centurion grabbed the sword from her hand and drove it through her body himself. Tacitus records the scene with cold precision. Her mother, who had urged suicide, now watched helplessly as soldiers killed her daughter in the gardens she had schemed to possess. When word reached Claudius that Messalina was dead, his reaction was chilling in its emptiness. According to Tacitus, he asked for another cup of wine and continued with his dinner as if nothing had happened. Suetonius provides a slightly different but equally disturbing account, noting that Claudius seemed to have forgotten about her death entirely and absent-mindedly asked why she wasn't at dinner. In the days that followed, the sources agree he showed no sign of grief, anger, joy, or any human emotion at all. Tacitus describes him as utterly blank, as if the woman he'd been married to for 10 years had never existed. Whether this was shock, relief, emotional protection, or genuine indifference, we'll never know. But the absence of any reaction at all suggests something had broken in Claudius that night. Within a few weeks, he was planning his marriage to Agrippina the Younger. Within a few years, Agrippina would almost certainly poison him to make way for her son Nero. The Senate moved quickly to erase Messalina from history. They ordered a damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of memory. Her name was chiseled off monuments. Her images were removed from public spaces. Coins bearing her face were defaced or melted down. The goal was to make it as if she had never existed, leaving only whispered warnings about the dangers of ambitious women who forgot their place. But the propaganda had already done its work. The scandalous stories about the nymphomaniac empress who worked in brothels were too entertaining to forget. They spread and evolved, growing more outrageous with each retelling, until the real Messalina disappeared entirely beneath the legend. So who was Valeria Messalina really? A sexually insatiable deviant who snuck out to brothels and competed with prostitutes? Or a capable but ruthless politician destroyed by gender-based character assassination? The honest answer is we'll never know for certain. The sources are too compromised, too biased, too invested in particular narratives to trust completely. What we can say with confidence is that the most salacious stories about her sexual exploits are almost certainly exaggerations, if not complete inventions. The brothel tales come from satirists and biased historians writing decades later. They serve obvious propaganda purposes, delegitimizing Messalina's son's claim to imperial succession and providing moral lessons about uncontrolled female sexuality. They rely on unlikely scenarios that defy both logic and Roman social structures. Modern scholars increasingly recognize these stories for what they are: misogynistic propaganda designed to destroy a woman's reputation because she wielded political power in a system that had no legitimate space for female authority. This doesn't make Messalina innocent. She almost certainly did orchestrate executions and suicides of political rivals. She did accumulate wealth through questionable means. She did attempt some kind of alliance or marriage with Gaius Silius that threatened her husband's rule. Whether this was a coup attempt, a desperate bid to secure her son's future, or simply a reckless love affair, the action itself was undeniably treasonous. Messalina was likely guilty of serious political crimes. But being a cunning and ruthless political operator is very different from being a mindless nymphomaniac obsessed with sexual conquest. The tragedy of Messalina is that we'll probably never recover the real woman beneath 2,000 years of sensationalized storytelling. Roman historians weren't interested in accurate psychological portraits. They wanted moral lessons and entertaining scandals. Later writers copied and embellished these accounts without critical examination. Artists and novelists for centuries used Messalina as a symbol of female sexual depravity, each generation adding their own lurid details. The actual young woman who died in those gardens has been lost, replaced by a caricature that says more about ancient and modern anxieties about powerful women than it does about historical reality. What we're left with is a cautionary tale, but not the one the ancient authors intended. The real lesson of Messalina isn't about the dangers of female sexuality. It's about how easily reputation can be weaponized, how history is written by those with power, and how the truth can be buried beneath layers of politically motivated fiction. Every emperor after Claudius had reasons to make the Julio-Claudian dynasty look depraved and incompetent. Every rival of Britannicus had reasons to make people doubt his legitimacy. Every writer working in an intensely misogynistic culture had reasons to portray powerful women as sexually deviant. Messalina became the perfect target for all these motivations to converge. If you found this exploration of ancient propaganda and character assassination fascinating, make sure you're subscribed to the Codex of History. Give this video a like to help more people discover the truth behind the legends. And let me know in the comments what historical figure you'd like us to investigate next. Because the past isn't always what we've been told it was. And sometimes the real story is even more interesting than the scandal.